Hi, and welcome to another video from the CTAD Clinic. My name is Dr. Mike Lloyd and I'm the Clinic Director. In today's video, I'm going to be looking at a semantic difference between the notions of being triggered and being activated. These are both part of an overall trauma response sequence. And it applies in this context mostly for folks with dissociative identity disorder or other specified dissociative disorders, where there are parts inside the system determining or influencing specified courses of action. Again, this is something that we see in the clinical context, and thoughts or impressions on this may vary between clinicians. This is sort of how we look at this, and a way of explaining it to people why certain things might happen at specific times. So both being triggered and both being activated are part of an overall system that we would consider, say, as a set of action systems. So we've done a video in the past about action systems, again, well worth looking up at that to get a bit of background as to what that might mean in this context. To start, we think about some definitions. So to be triggered would be defined more or less as follows: a response caused by a particular action, process, or situation. So it's a response. Now, a response is often a thought-through response. We can see response or reaction being the same in this context. So a trigger occurs, it leads to a specific type of response, often within the trauma threat response systems, such as fight, flight, or freeze. It can often be an uncoordinated, random, unpredictable response, i.e. an event takes place and a person is triggered and they then react or respond according to the circumstance, and that might change in each time. So one example might lead to a flight response, one situation might then lead to a freeze response. The person doesn't necessarily know, they're locked into that pattern, and then that whatever happens next happens next. Now that occurs for everybody, so any one of us can be triggered into a specific fight, flight, freeze type response. Action systems are very different in that when we're activated, an action system or a sequence takes place that is more likely to be predictable. So when we think about activation, we're thinking about a process that begins, but that process is a developed, often predictable, understood, makes sense sequence of events. So thinking being triggered is something that is quite fast, like you walk around the corner and you might see somebody who reminds you of an abuser or a threatening individual, and you can be triggered, you can be shocked, and you might freeze on the spot, you might run away, or you might run towards that person shouting. You don't necessarily know or coordinate that response, it just happens for you. Activated would be a better example, let's say, of you're walking through a supermarket and you see some sweets or some toys on one of the shelves, and suddenly a child part emerges and wants to sit down and start playing with those sweets and toys. So the action system of the child part to play is then set in motion by seeing the sweets. So we could say, if we wanted to, that they're triggered into wanting to play by seeing the sweets, but I think we try and keep triggered as a sort of the negative trauma response rather than the activation. This would be that nothing really is going on, you're walking through the supermarket and suddenly you're activated and the child part is there, and it plays through a predictable sequential series of actions, movements, behaviors, gestures, or conversations that could take place over a period of time in many different contexts over the course of a lifetime. So what we're looking at then is a sort of an instant threat response versus a predictable sequence of events that take place in a specific context. Again, triggered can occur for anybody with a trauma history. The activation that we're talking about is much more within that complex dissociative group where there is an internal system that can either influence from within, i.e. OSDD, or a part can take over and generate a series of behaviors. But those behaviors are understood and they're consistent over a period of time. So certain things might lead to specific action sequences. So for example, being called to dinner might lead to an action sequence of a part coming through that either overeats or undereats, or has a very specific way of being able to eat, and that action replays itself time and time again. So we would say that the call to dinner is then leading to an activation of that part. We wouldn't say that someone's triggered by the call to dinner unless there was a very, very specific trauma related to that. So the activation of the part takes place, it's not a trigger. If for some reason that you were surprised by the call to dinner and that was a trauma response and you were triggered, that would lead to a fight, flight or freeze response. Think in terms of sort of the shock value of that. It's not really going to happen if it's an everyday thing. So there will be countless examples of one and the other where they'll be very different, and there's a little bit of overlap. We're thinking in simplistic terms here. Obviously there is going to be overlap between the two, but what we're doing is just trying to make sense of the two principles because they are a little bit complex, and I don't want to sort of overcomplicate by looking at the sort of myriad of different variations that can take place within this. It might come across as a little bit semantic, the difference between being triggered and activated, but what it actually leads to is the sort of the conclusion of what we then do with that information, and that's key. Because when a system has been activated and an action system plays itself out, i.e. a series of behavioral or communicative sequences, the person who's sort of on the receiving end of that, either sort of the main, say, person or the body or whoever is sort of like trying to oversee things at that time, can get very cross, can get very upset that that's happened. Obviously, we try and affect that with compassion, understanding, and empathy. The process of a sequence being activated allows us to understand what the internal needs are of the system. So whether it's a supermarket, or whether it's a call to dinner, or whether it's anything else, if that sequence takes place, the goal isn't really to just completely block it. The goal really is to understand why it would happen at that time, to be able to predict it, to contain that behavior with empathy and understanding, and lead to a change or an organic evolution or development of that action sequence. So it's about trying to think about the functionality of it. So in the middle of a supermarket, if a child comes out and begins playing, that's really not adaptive. So we would think, okay, we can kind of guess that that's going to happen. We know that this sequence is going to be there. We can feel the sequence starting to happen, the part beginning to emerge. We've already planned how we're going to manage this, deal with it, so it becomes much more of an adaptive thing. You can be empathic to the child part for coming out, not cross, not upset, not punishing, not critical, not dismissive, to be thoughtful and understanding and give it options for being able to address those needs in a more understandable and adaptive way. So triggered is something that we have to respond to. We react to that threat or perception of threat, because often a trigger isn't a real threat, it's just the perception of threat. The activation is a sequential process that we need to break down, understand, locate the context, and develop a compassionate, thoughtful process towards figuring out what's going on and how to improve it. It's always the goal of this is to try and change this. As always, this is stuff that is best taken place within therapy, because being able to talk these things through with the therapist to reduce all of those sequences down to their essential components to make sense of it is to determine the logic. That logic gives us a sense of reason as to why a thing happens. That kind of takes down that emotional strain of why did this happen? You know why. Then we can move into what do we do about it? How do we make sure that that is improved and developed so it becomes more adaptive or functional in the future? Whenever one of these activated systems takes place, it then provides an opportunity for being able to notice, to develop that understanding. That's what we're trying to achieve with this. We can always improve on triggers. So when a person is triggered, we can't necessarily do a lot about that, as in being triggered. What we do is the after effect, and that would be something that we can discuss in a different video about how to manage, look after triggered consequences and impacts. For the time being, for folks to be able to understand how it is that their emotional, behavioral or communicative system changes when something is happening in the environment, this is a nice way of to start looking about it. Being able to understand the difference between being triggered and activated. One is a threat response, one is a sequential program designed to do well in that environment in whatever way that might be. So if you take it on those and sort of think about that, that will be a really good start. We can develop this as we go along with other videos. So I hope that this has been a useful question for people who may not have really had this kind of semantic language used in therapy or in their process of understanding themselves, but being able to look at it in this way does create a new platform by which to understand how an internal system can emerge and do stuff, why that might have happened in that time. I think curiosity is always a key part of our understanding about the internal aspects of dissociation, and my hope is that this video really is going to develop some curiosity in people to look at these activated sequences in a bit more detail with a therapist if you have them, and develop that understanding. So we'll do more videos. Please continue supporting the CTAD channel on YouTube. It's really great that people doing so. Again, I love all the comments and the feedback we get from these videos. We'll keep producing more content. And in the meantime, please do take great care.